out, and it freaks most of us out to think about that. Little biting bugs and mosquitoes and chiggers, they seem to love me. I mean, if anyone in our family, we go camping or something, if anyone gets bit, it seems like I'm the one that gets bit by those things. So I hate them with a passion. I'll never forget, I was in grade school, very young. I was sitting behind a young girl one day in class and was distracted by this movement in her hair. Her hair was alive. It was full of, infested with a colony of head lice in her hair. And that kind of thing, from that point on, certainly I thought nothing more about what was going on in class, what the teacher was saying. I was just completely distracted with what was going on in front of me there, and the thought that would send shivers up most of our spines. Thought of these little blood-sucking creatures. And that's the tool that God was using to bring Egypt to his knees. We're going to look at Exodus, the 8th chapter, verses 16 to 19. It's fairly short reading, a fairly short plague. It's for a short time. I thought I would be combining the third and fourth plague. I've made it into one. So looking at Exodus, the 8th chapter, the Lord said unto Moses, say unto Aaron, stretch out thy rod and smite the dust of the land, that it may become lice throughout all the land of Egypt. And they did so, for Aaron stretched out his hand with his rod and smote the dust of the earth, and it became lice in man and in beast, and all the dust of the land became like lice throughout all the land of Egypt. And the magicians did so with their enchantments to bring forth lice, but they could not. So there were lice upon man and upon beast. The magician said to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. And Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he hearkened not unto them, as the Lord had said. I should have mentioned before this point in time, but I'm going to mention now, the language of the Old Testament, ancient Hebrew, is a dead language and a little tough to interpret. And so in the prior plague, the plague about the frogs, the Old Testament Hebrew word there we might interpret as croakers, not actually frogs. Hebrews weren't real familiar with frogs. They didn't have a word for them, and so they simply called them croakers, the sound they made. And so we translate that in the scripture as frogs. Now the same thing here. In this passage, it's hard to tell the Old Testament Hebrew language is speaking what type of insects these were that were used in this third plague. It's usually described as small flying things. The Hebrews were obviously not going to win any prizes in biology, insectology. Small flying thing, that's not a very technical phrase. So are these gnats? Are they lice? Translations, commentators have different ideas. Were they mosquitoes? There are places where swarms of mosquitoes actually drive people mad. And that gives you a taste of what's going on here. Insects that are from the dust of the earth. And there are two interesting observations I made about this plague. First, there's no warning this time. They don't go to Pharaoh with a warning concerning this plague. God's warnings were an act of grace. Pharaoh in the last plague said he would let the people go and then decided he would not. Secondly, the sorcerers, when they tried to copy this miracle, they couldn't. And then afterwards, they declare it the finger of God. I think this is a remarkable statement. It's kind of where we're going to, the path we're going to take off of this plague. It's a remarkable statement, especially considering the source. Here were these occultists, these sorcerers that didn't really know anything about God that much, but here they recognized the power of God. Pharaoh doesn't. He hardens his heart. Like every day, man's confronted with the finger of God, and so we're going to look in the Scriptures at a number of places where things are attributed to the finger of God. And we're going to talk about those this morning. The finger of God is a finger of challenge, of creation. It points to the truth, and we're going to examine throughout the Scriptures how the finger of God is witnessed in 5 aspects this morning. The first one we're looking at, it involves the plague here. As the plague begins, we look, at those first few verses. There's no warning, and we remember the first 2 plagues that Moses went to Pharaoh first, told them they were coming. In this plague, no warning, and in this plague, they simply carried out this unannounced. Pharaoh changed his mind last time, broke his promise, and now God visits this plague without announcement. We're told in verse 17 that this plague is vast. We noticed it's going to affect man and beast, every man, every beast, and we noticed it's described as the source is the dust of the earth. I think it may be actually where God created this plague, these insects, but I think it also speaks to the vastness of this plague, the dust of the earth. We look at a couple other places. We're in Exodus, so look back at Genesis, and they talk about the dust of the earth in a couple places. The first one in Genesis 13:16, I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth. He's speaking here to Abraham and telling him how his descendants are, how many there's going to be. And it describes it as the dust of the earth. No man can, basically, it's uncountable, without number. And then again in chapter 28, it says, again, this time speaking to Jacob, thy seed shall be as the dust of the earth, and thou shalt spread abroad to the west, east, north, and south. Jacob, your descendants are going to be like the dust of the earth. And so this phrase, again, meaning it's of a great number. And so God is saying it's going to, these gnats or flying insects are going to be all over Egypt. And they're going to be uncountable. So even though the creative finger of God can be seen everywhere, people refuse a lot of times to give credit to God for what He's done. I think we live in an age and time that we see a lot of things, and we do a lot of things with things we don't really understand how they work. We flip on a light switch, we expect the lights to come on, but do we understand the currents and where that electricity comes from? And maybe a little bit, but not so much. We turn our car on, we expect it to turn on, we expect it to go. Most of us don't know much about it anymore. Used to, you could get in there and really work on a car, sit in next to the engine. But nowadays it's so cram-packed in there, you don't know what half of that stuff does. We live in a time where we expect things to work for us with the flip of a switch. We expect things to work as they've always worked without really understanding them. And I think when people look at creation now, they see creation but don't really attribute it to the hand of God. The psalmist wrote in the 8th Psalm, when I consider the heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained, what is man that thou art mindful of him, and the son of man that thou visitest him? we really give credit to God and for the work of His finger, the creative work that He's done, we would be as the psalmist and wonder why God is mindful of us. In Romans, the first chapter, verse 25, for they changed the truth of God into a lie. They worshiped and served the created thing more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. And I think that's a lot of what has happened in our day and time as we think about finger of God and creation. We're going to move on to now the finger of God and how it addresses our character. This one we look at Deuteronomy, the 9th chapter, verse 10. Well, the Lord delivered unto me 2 tablets of stone written with the finger of God, and on them were written according to all the words which the Lord spake with you in the mount out of the midst of the fire in the day of the assembly. So here in Deuteronomy, the 9th chapter, reveals that the 10 commandments that Moses received, the first of the old law there, were written by the very finger of God. These 10 commandments, they were a start to make man understand how his character was supposed to be shaped, things that he should do, things that he should do. When we look at the purpose of the law, it's explained to us in the New Testament in a couple of places. Romans, the 7th chapter, says this, therefore the law is holy, and the commandment holy and just and good. Was in that which is good made death unto me? God forbid, but sin, which it might appear sin, working death in me by that which is good, that sin by the commandment might become exceedingly sinful. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. So what he's saying there is pretty much a lot like what is said in Galatians there, that the law is exposing us, is making us understand what sin is. Galatians 3, and in verse 19, therefore then serveth the law, it was added because of transgressions, till the seed should come to whom the promise was made, and it was ordained by angels in the hand of the mediator. Now a mediator is not a mediator one, but God is one. Is the law then against the promises of God? God forbid. For if there had been a law given which could have given life, verily righteousness should have been by the law. But the Scripture hath concluded all under sin, that the promise by faith of Jesus Christ might be given to them that believe. But before faith came, we were kept under the law, shut up unto the faith that should be afterwards be revealed. Therefore the law was our schoolmaster to bring us unto Christ, that we might be justified by faith. I think that probably a little clearer than the reading in Romans there, that the law was to prepare us, was to get us ready for the time of Christ, because the law, no one could fulfill the law. No one could keep it. To that end, the law was good. In fact, it was a great success when we think from the day that Moses received it on Sinai to the present, no one alive except Jesus Christ was able to keep it, was able to fulfill it. Who can say that I've never placed anything above God in my priorities? Who can say I've never had the presence of idols in my life? Who can honestly say that we've always used the name of God honorably, worshipped with the saints on the first day of the week all times? And who can say without boasting that they've honored and obeyed their parents? And who can profess they've never experienced hatred for someone else? Have we always been honest beyond measure? never taking what's not rightfully ours, always putting in an honest day's work. Who can admit to having never told a lie in their life and always not never coveted someone else's property, person, position? The law found us out. The finger of God is pointed at us and shows that we are sinful. We needed Christ. We could not keep the old law. The finger of God also reveals our conduct. Now this would have been a long reading of Daniel, chapter 5. It's a very interesting story there. It shows us how man will behave when he does not believe that God is in his life. Belshazzar was a bad king, bad pagan king. His gods were the gods of his own making. He did not have time for the one true God, especially since his father had pillaged God's temple, removing the sacred vessels and emblems, and he stored them as spoils of war within his palace in Babylon. And we can only imagine how proudly Belshazzar produced these artifacts at his feast when he was feasting with those of his important visitors and important lords and so forth. And he enjoyed this, employing them for his own personal use. It was a symbol of his power, of might, a picture of the position of the king, the great nation of Babylon. Like many people today, he lived without thinking of God, without a thought of God. Proverbs tells us that the king's heart is in the hand of God. Without realizing that, Proverb said there, he and his father had merely been an instrument in trying to bring the wayward Jews back to God. Belshazzar revealed his own history, his own greatness. He was boasting in that, and many people of privilege give themselves over to excesses of all sorts, and here we see him partying with his important guests, boasting of his greatness. He's acting as though God does not exist, cannot get to him. God, one true God, will not act, will not judge him. The psalmist wrote in the 55th Psalm, verse 19, God shall hear and afflict them, he did abide of old, Selah, because they have no changes, therefore they fear not God. I brought this one in because of that second part of that verse there. Because they have no changes, therefore they fear not God. In other words, because everything is the same. Nothing's changed day to day. Men assume that nothing's going to change tomorrow. God's not going to act. Nothing's going to be any different than it was today. Modern men have ruled out the possibility of Jesus' return. They consider themselves more sophisticated than the Bible truth, and they throw every idea that God will judge them out of their minds. That does not even come into play there. And they're in for a shock, just as Belshazzar was. As he sat there, probably half drunk there with his other important guests, praising the idols of Babylon, the finger of God appears and writes on the wall. Kind of sobers up very quickly there as the finger etches out in the plaster of his wall there, and it says, once he gets it interpreted there, that God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. You have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. What did this great man do? Did he not believe it? Did he rage against the finger of God? No, he believed it. Color drained from his face, and they were all astonished what had happened. Let me tell you something that's going to happen to all great men when they face the finger of God. Same thing. They may all be astonished at first, but they're going to believe. What is the end? That is the end of all of earth's mighty men when God calls them into account. It is one thing, as some do, to play the big man, the hard man in a human court. I think we are more important than we can withstand the judgment of our fellow man. It's a completely different thing when we become judged by God. There are no strong men before God. In the book of Revelation, the 6th chapter, it says, "And the kings of the earth, and great men, the rich men, and the chief captains, and the mighty men, and every bound men, and every free man, hid themselves in the dens and the rocks of the mountains, and said unto the mountains and rocks, Fall upon us, and hide us from the face of him that sitteth upon the throne, from the wrath of the Lamb. And the great day of wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand?" By this command, God has found us out in principle. His judgment will find us out in practice. And we'll ask, as John says in that last verse, and then on that great day, who will be able to stand? What will you do when at last the finger of God is pointing at you and you are the attention of God? The finger of God also addresses our conscience. In John the 8th chapter, as Jesus was at the Mount of Olives, and early in the morning he came again to the temple, and all the people came unto him, and he sat down and taught them. Scribes and Pharisees brought a woman taken in adultery, and when they had set her in the midst, they said unto him, Master, this woman was taken in adultery in the very act. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned, but what sayest thou? And they said, tempting him, that they might accuse him. But Jesus stooped down, and with his finger wrote in the ground, as though he heard them not. And when they continued asking him, he lifted up himself and said unto them, He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her. And again he stooped down and wrote in the ground. And they which heard it, being convicted by their own conscience, went out one by one, being at the eldest even to the last, and Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. When Jesus had lifted himself, and saw none but the woman, he said unto her, Woman, where are those thine accusers? Hath no man condemned thee? And she said, No man, Lord. And Jesus said unto her, Neither do I condemn thee. Go, sin no more. A lot of speculation has gone into here. We have no idea what Jesus wrote with his finger in this passage. It's been suggested, I don't necessarily agree with any of these, but it's been suggested that maybe he wrote the law pertaining to adultery, that both parties should be there for stoning, not just the woman. Said maybe it was the name of the man whom she was found with, the names of the others in here in the lynch mob who condemned this woman and were condemned of the same sin, or the sins of her accusers. But we won't know. We'll never know on this side of eternity what Jesus wrote at this particular time, but the effect of what he wrote, we do know. For looking down at the crowd, he said, He that was without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her. It's very easy to examine the sin in someone else's life and say, yeah, they need some help. They need need to get sin out of their lives. It's easy to find someone whose life might be morally worse than our own. Probably thinking I will go to this passage next. Luke 6, verses 41 and 42, words of Jesus, "And why beholdest thou the mote which is in thy brother's eye, and perceiveth not the beam that is in thine own eye? Either how can thou sayest to thy brother, Brother, let me pull out the mote which is in thine eye, when thou thyself beholdest not the beam that is in thine own eye? Thou hypocrite, cast out first the beam out of thine own eye, then thou shalt see clearly to pull the mote out of thy brother's eye." A lot of things have been said about this verse. The obvious lesson that most get out of it, that we need to examine ourselves and clean up our own act, but it doesn't say to leave the mote in your brother's eye either. We have to do some self-examination, certainly, and clean up our own lives. The finger of God points, it doesn't point to the sins of others. First, it points to our own. I also want to mention 2 Corinthians 5, verse 10. It says, "We must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that everyone may receive the things done in his body according to that which he hath done, whether it be good or bad." The finger of God searches my heart, reveals my life, and exposes my motives. And like the Pharisees, we're too willing to expose others and try to hide the problems that may exist in our own life. Had we stood in the crowd that day, I'm afraid we would have probably not been much better off than those Pharisees. And we too would have had to walk away with our head bowed in shame, unwilling to pass judgment upon a fellow sinner. It would seem the finger of God is very daunting to address creation, our character, our conduct, and our conscience. Seems not much positive is coming out of this, but we're examining one last passage here. It addresses our condition, and here we look at Luke, the 11th chapter, verse 20. "But if I, with the finger of God, cast out devils, no doubt the kingdom of God has come upon you." The finger of God is associated with deliverance. The context of this passage here, Jesus has been accused of casting out devils by the power of Beelzebub, by the power of the devil. There are many people out there that will do anything to distract from the reality, the truth of Christ, deceive you with a lie. But the Lord points out that Satan is not likely to dismantle his own kingdom. He's not going to take his own kingdom apart. Jesus delivered not by the power of Satan, but by the finger of God. That same finger that turned the dust into lice in Egypt. The same finger that etched the commandments on the stones of tablet, its 10 commandments at the top of Mount Sinai. The same finger of God that inscribed upon Belshazzar's wall. The same finger that drew in the hot sands of Israel, pricking the conscience of the Pharisees. That hand that so readily condemns us is also the one that saves us and delivers us. God's finger represents power. In the first instance, it symbolized God's power to judge us. God has a right to that. No man is able to stand before him. By what right? And by grace, that same finger is powerful toward us. That finger of God allows us to be delivered. The Bible says, but as many as you received him and gave to be powers became the sons of God. In 1 John, in the Gospel of John, 1st chapter, verse 12. That also is the finger of God. It takes away our sins, takes away the sins of the world. It depends on which side, how we react to that. The sorcerers, in that rare moment of clarity, said to Pharaoh, we can't duplicate this. This is the finger of God. This is God at work here, creating this plague. Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he hearkened not unto them. How different things might have been had Pharaoh laid hold onto that finger and in a different way. One of the joys of fatherhood, motherhood occurs, I think, when your child is very young, they're just barely there, and you're holding that child in your arms, and then you feel that little hand reach and grab your finger, and grab a hold of it, curl it around your finger. At that moment, we understand the dependency that that child has upon us. It's unable to do things for itself. And then that grasp, that trust that we feel of that little one that it has toward us. In much the same way, we are to grasp a hold of God's finger in that act of faith, that we trust him to deliver us, to save us. And we place our faith in him for all he's done and what he's done through Calvary. That finger of God is a fearsome thing to be on the judgment side of it, but it doesn't have to be if we trust him also to deliver us. Kind of keeping track of the things that the plagues went through, we find this is the first time that the magicians are unable to duplicate the plague, and from here out, I don't think they're mentioned at all to even try. And we also see some other things as we will continue on that kind of follow a pattern of three there of the warning, how the warnings go. But we're going to see that more evident as we continue on in the next plagues. Hopefully we'll get to them in coming times.